As I said, I'm Bob Dandrew, one of the co-founders of Partners for Climate Action. And what I'd like to do, we have a number of staff members here and at least one other co-founder. Can I just have the staff stand up, please? Just so you guys have questions afterward. These are the folks. Oh, and here's Jack McDonald, one of our co-founders as well. Just having them recognized. Great. So I want to do three things quickly. First of all, just tell you a little bit about this event and how it's going to run. I want to tell you a little bit about Partners for Climate Action. And then I'm going to introduce the fellow who's going to introduce our speaker. So Partners for Climate Action was founded about 4 years ago by a group of friends and colleagues who all reached the same decision in their lives about what they were doing and where they were going to put their time, feeling very strongly that the dual challenge of climate change and ecological decline are clearly two of the biggest issues, existential issues facing us. And we all felt we wanted to do something about it. We also recognize, of course, these are global issues, but we're going to be dealing with it locally. So we've dedicated ourselves to helping communities in the Hudson Valley, in the bioregion of the Hudson Valley, which is the Hudson River estuary watershed, to get proactive in facing these challenges and getting organized for what's ahead of us. So we do this through both direct programmatic work and also grant making. In our programmatic work, there's a number of things, but perhaps the highlights would include our Local Champions program, which Vanessa Bertozzi co-leads, which is a training and support program for community volunteers who are working to get their towns climate smart in New York State. This is a certification, an important step in accessing state funding and other things. We have a program that we launched with the Mid-Hudson Library System called Libraries of Local, which are sustainability resource hubs and monthly programming in 17 libraries now and growing. That includes both books and films, but also seed libraries and tool libraries, and starting this year, the Library of People, where community members with particular skills, like I know how to garden, can actually sign up and be checked out the library to assist their neighbors in that work. We have a new program called Pollinate HV, which is very exciting. We've just launched, my colleague Avalon Bungie just launched that. Check that out, pollinatehv.org. We are losing our pollinators, and of course that's a huge issue, and this being an agricultural district, we want to do everything to get them back. So Pollinate HV is addressing that on both sides of the Hudson River. New toolkit that's been launched, and a seed line coming out of native local ecotype seeds for at-risk pollinators. And then let me just tell you a little bit about the grant making. We raise money. Every dollar we give away, we've raised, and we have been able to give away over $3 million in the last 3 years to Hudson Valley communities for a range of things. We have a current program now that's focused on building decarbonization, helping municipalities and nonprofits get off of fossil fuels. We're actually closing an application on Sunday for youth action grants. This is in conjunction with Bloomberg Philanthropies. So if you know of young people ages 15 to 24 who want to take action where the climate's concerned, have them check out our website and submit an application. And then finally, our ecological restoration grants. And this is leading to the fellow I'm going to introduce next. Last year, with our ecological restoration grants, we got an application from the town of Gallatin for something called a deer exclosure which I'd never heard of. And we funded it. And getting to know the fellow and the committee, this was really a project of the town's Conservation Advisory Commission, for me to learn, and I think all of us at the organization, about the degree to which our forests are really in decline and facing collapse if we don't do something about it. So that launched us on a whole process. We created a task force, a special task force. I'll let Eli talk about that, to really study this. And then we realized everybody needs to know this. Like the whole bioregion needs to wake up and see what's happening, so that we can decide what we want to do about it. So we have put ourselves on a learning journey, and we've invited all of you to join us to understand both the causes of the problems facing forests and some of the remedies, so that we can make our choices about what we want to do about that. So it starts tonight with this and continues next week with a tour of a healthy forest that's been protected by a deer exclosure. The person who has really been the guiding light is Eli Arnow, who I'm about to welcome up here. Eli is graduate of Union College and then SUNY ESF, a graduate degree in ecological restoration. And he stewards hundreds of acres here in Columbia County. He knows more about this topic than anybody I know. And we're really grateful to him for chairing our committee. So Eli, come on up and you can introduce our speaker. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, I'm Eli Arnow, the chair of our Forest Health Task Force, and I'll tell you a little bit about our work. So our Forest Health Task Force was formed this past October to address growing concerns about forest health in the Hudson Valley bioregion. We're working to build public awareness about the threats to forest health and the best strategies to address these threats. I'd like to invite our task force to stand for a second. Bob, where's Jack? Troy and Kate and Rick Fallu couldn't make it tonight. Thank you all for your good work. So as we'll hear more about tonight, well-managed deer populations are crucial for forest health. Only when deer populations are in balance can our forests do their job of mitigating climate change, sustaining a diversity of native plants and wildlife, and supporting our economies and communities. Our task force was established to bring new leadership to forest health issues like deer overpopulation. We're working with diverse stakeholders, including rural and suburban residents, hunters, and policymakers. And together we can shift perspectives and inspire sustainable solutions to the challenges facing our forests. So today, we're thrilled to welcome Brendan Quirion, head deer and bear biologist at New York State DEC. He received his BA from SUNY Cobleskill and an MS from Cornell, where he completed his master's thesis evaluating monitoring protocols to assess deer impacts on forests. Today, he's going to shed some light on the complex relationship between deer and forest health and the role of management strategies at DEC. Please join me in a warm welcome for Brendan.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and special thanks to Eli, Troy, and Partners for Climate Action for organizing this event. Obviously, this is something that I think about every day, but many more people need to understand this problem and what we can do to protect our forests from deer impacts. And that's part of the reason why I've been giving a presentation like this pretty much every month since I started with DEC, trying to educate as many people as possible. And so the focus of my presentation tonight is going to be how we got here and where we need to go to restore balance. And I'm going to be starting out with kind of a natural history overview and a basic overview of terrestrial ecology to kind of set the frame for some of the things that we need to consider moving forward. So how did we get here? Thanks. So basic terrestrial ecology teaches us that most terrestrial ecosystems have three trophic levels. We have our primary producers at the bottom, our plants. Then we have our herbivores, in this case, deer that feed on those plants. And at the top of the food chain, we have our predators. We have our apex predators. Historically, we've had wolves, mountain lions, and us as subsistence hunters. We've also had mesopredators in the system, bobcats, coyote, and black bear. And we've also had, historically, more severe winters. And this has been the system that historically has kept deer populations in balance with available habitat. And up until the advent of unregulated market hunting, deer populations were in balance and then were almost brought to the brink of extinction. So throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, unregulated market hunting, where hunters would go into places like the Adirondacks, the Catskills, harvest large numbers of deer, and that meat would get transported down to the cities, brought deer populations down to almost complete extirpation in New York State. There were only remnant populations in the Adirondacks and Catskills left by the turn of the 1900s. And many people don't realize this, that it was almost to the point where deer were completely gone from New York. And throughout this same period of time, we lost species like the passenger pigeon, the heath hen, bison almost went extinct in North America. And simultaneously, there was tremendous land use change occurring. So much of our forest land was deforested for agriculture and the tanning industry. So these are pictures from New England where large tracts of land were converted to agriculture. And this is actually a picture of a river, believe it or not, with the number of logs floating down it for the timber industry. And so this combined effect of unregulated market hunting and habitat destruction resulted in the extirpation of our apex predators. So we no longer have wolves or mountain lions as a result of this. And it wasn't until the advent of modern wildlife management where these species that were being impacted by this started to recover. And so in 1937, the Pittman-Robertson Act was passed, and essentially it created an excise tax on the purchase of ammo and hunting licenses and fishing equipment. And that money then was dedicated to state wildlife agencies to use to increase wildlife populations and promote habitat. And so this has been the model that has guided much of the wildlife management that's occurred in North America since 1937. And part of that was the recolonization and reintroduction of deer. This is actually one of the greatest conservation success stories in North America. You'll notice that the Wildlife Restoration Grant program, the logo is a white-tailed deer. That's because deer were brought back from the brink of extinction. They were brought from areas where they had those remnant populations still in the Adirondacks and Catskills and reintroduced to throughout New York and the rest of the country. Now imagine though, when deer were brought into these landscapes that no longer had apex predators and had been logged and had new forests coming up, what that would do to the deer population. Essentially, they were unchecked from an apex predator standpoint, and they had ideal habitat to rebound in population. And so it should come as no surprise that deer populations rebounded dramatically over the last century. And so this is a depiction of deer densities across the United States. This first depiction here is estimated deer density in 1982. So what you're seeing here is areas in green are where there were low deer density, areas in yellow, and then into the purples were areas with moderately or high deer density. And even just a couple decades later, here's how that map changed. We saw deer population densities increase dramatically across most of the country, where more and more counties were in that high deer density category. And this brought about the advent of deer overabundance and deer impacts. And this is what we're experiencing today in many areas of the Hudson Valley. So these impacts that we're experiencing, like increased deer damage to agriculture, the spread of tick-borne diseases, deer impacts to ornamental plantings, increased deer vehicle collisions, these are all outcomes or symptoms of this deer overabundance crisis. And it's not just me that understands or realizes this. This is a story that came out in 2023. Fear the Deer, crash data illuminates America's deadliest animal. And what they found is that deer are responsible for the deaths of about 440 of the estimated 458 Americans killed in physical confrontations with wildlife in an average year. And that's through deer vehicle collisions. So deer are actually the most dangerous animal in North America, believe it or not. It's not grizzly bears, it's not wolves, it's not cougars, it's deer. So now let's fast forward to present day. And what I'm going to be depicting here is what's referred to as a trophic cascade in ecology. So we no longer have our apex predators in the system. Wolves and mountain lions are no longer present in New York. As a result of that reduced mortality from predation, deer populations have been able to expand. And when deer populations expand, because they are herbivores, they browse more intensively on our forest vegetation. And so our forest vegetation is then compromised as a result of that, and that's where the cascade occurs. Our subsistence hunting has also transitioned to regulated hunting, and the other primary source of human mortality on deer is through deer vehicle collisions, but this is definitely not to the same level that unregulated market hunting and subsistence hunting, the level of mortality that those two factors contributed to deer populations in the past. And again, deer populations have been able to expand in certain areas because of that, which has increased browse pressure on our forest ecosystems and plant communities. Lastly, climate change has reduced the intensity and severity of severe winters. So we no longer have severe winter mortality affecting deer populations like they once did. And again, as a result of that, deer populations have expanded in areas where they historically were kept lower, like areas like the Adirondacks and Catskills. And because of that, we're experiencing browse impacts in new areas that haven't been impacted as severely before. So that series of slides made it seem like we're losing our forest. That's really not what's happening. It's a little bit more sinister and under the radar than that. And that's why most people don't realize that there's actually a problem. And so I want to demonstrate what's actually happening in these situations where deer are becoming overabundant. Imagine for a second a forest understory that's comprised of a suite of native plants that range in high nutrition and palatability to low nutrition and palatability to deer. And that's what you're seeing on the screen here. So those plants in green represent species that are high in nutrients, high palatability, and those ones in red are low nutrition, low palatability. As deer populations expand, you'd expect those highly desired species to disappear first from the system. They're the ones that deer really want to feed on. As deer populations continue to expand, you would expect those moderate palatability species to then decline. And this allows those low nutrient, low palatability species to begin to expand. Many of you are probably aware of some of the terrestrial invasive plants that are affecting our ecosystems right now. Things like Japanese barberry, garlic mustard. In many instances, they are being promoted by deer because the deer are feeding on and reducing the native species that would compete with them. And so you can eventually get to a point where deer populations have become so high that the only plants in the understory are things that deer don't eat. And it can even become so severe that there's almost nothing in the understory. Basically grasses and leaves are all that's left. And so these preferred species that deer feed on are starting to disappear from our forests. I'm sure many of you are forest owners and have walked through your forest recently. I would challenge you to think about the last time that you saw a trillium or an orchid or a yew or a hemlock seedling or even oak seedlings in your forest understory. What you probably saw instead were things like this: Japanese barberry, garlic mustard, Japanese stilt grass, multiflora rose, maybe American beech or striped maple. So all of these species that our forests are transitioning to have two things in common. They either have chemical or structural defenses that protect them from deer, or they are undigestible. So for example, two of the species up here have these thorns that prevent them from being readily consumed by deer. Garlic mustard, it has chemical defenses that protect it from deer. Japanese stilt grass has high lignin content that makes it very difficult to digest for deer. And striped maple and American beech are essentially considered weed trees by most foresters. They're not really quality or high quality timber species that most foresters desire. And so our forest ecosystems are starting to transition to these alternate states where the mature trees that you see above you are not reflected in what's underneath. And so our future forests is going to look more like what's in the understory long term, because those tree species that need to be regenerated eventually don't have those seedlings in the understory to replace them. And so as I was driving over from Freehold this evening, I was looking up into the forest on my way over, and many of the forest looked similar to these photos. These are all examples of deer impacted forests. And to an untrained eye, you might say, it looks green. What's wrong with this situation? And it really requires an understanding of these forest ecosystems and how they're being impacted to understand that there's a problem here. So for example, this is an example of a stump sprout here after a timber harvest that's been completely browsed down by deer. These stump sprouts typically would replace those harvested trees in a healthy forest. If that's happening, that mature tree isn't going to be replaced. This is an example of an understory dominated by Japanese barberry, where really the only species present in the understory is barberry, primarily because deer don't eat it, and the native species that deer do eat aren't there to compete with it. This is an example of a fern glade. Ferns are also a species that deer don't readily consume. And so if you have an understory comprised of hay-scented fern, bracken fern, that's probably a situation where you have too many deer on the landscape and ferns have been able to take over. Down here is kind of a worst case scenario. I worked in Region 3 DEC for a while out of New Paltz, and I would go down to Westchester County, and this is typically what I would see in the forest understory. Basically no native plants and Japanese stilt grass taking over the understory. Again, this is deer driven. Deer don't consume grasses very readily because they're hard to digest and they don't have high nutrition. And so grasses, especially invasive grasses, are able to spread when deer are overabundant and have compromised our native plant communities. Here's an example of a deer browse line on arborvitae. You can see clearly that everything below that 4 or 5 foot height range has been browsed down basically to nothing, where you can see straight through the forest understory. And here's an example of that in an eastern deciduous forest, where everything below that 5 or 6 foot line has been browsed down. You have some remnant vegetation, but you can see straight through the forest, and there's very little understory. This is also clearly captured in deer exclosures, and this is why Eli has established one on his property, and there's a network of these established throughout the Hudson Valley. It's a night and day difference when you put up a fence that excludes deer in these forest ecosystems. So each picture here depicts outside and inside the deer exclosure, inside and outside, inside and outside, inside and outside. And this doesn't take long to manifest. Even within a few years, you can see this level of response in certain forest settings. Now, it's important to mention here that these are also artificial systems. We'd never want to see a deer completely removed from a system, but they provide us a very good sense of what could happen if deer were brought into better balance with the forest ecosystem. And of course, this has tremendous impacts on other species of wildlife. If you remove the food resources available, the nesting resources available, any other resources in the understory that these wildlife rely on, you can expect impacts on them as well. So things like ground nesting birds, small mammals, even amphibians and invertebrates are impacted by deer overabundance through what's called a reverse trophic ricochet. Because those plants have been compromised, the trophic levels above those plants start getting impacted. And because of this, some have started to question, are deer a greater threat than climate change? You know, in some instances, it may actually be the case that deer are a greater threat than climate change, at least in the short term. And deer are also contributing to climate change, and I'll talk about this later. We also need to remember that this is also not a good situation for the deer themselves. If deer essentially eat themselves out of house and home, if they are stressed by a severe winter where they need to navigate through deep snow, this isn't a deer lying down, by the way. This is a deer walking through extremely deep snow. And if you see deer doing this, going up on their hind legs to access browse on your cedars, that's because there's nothing else in the understory for them to get to. They're trying to reach the highest point possible to be able to browse what's available. And so when you receive a severe winter again, when deer populations have become overabundant, they can succumb to winter mortality. So you can have these massive die-off events that occur as a result of that. And this historically happened in areas of the Adirondacks and Catskills. Not so much anymore because of climate change and our milder winters that we're experiencing, but it is possible. This also has important implications for disease dynamics. So 2 or 3 years ago, the Hudson Valley was impacted by a disease called epizootic hemorrhagic disease. And it resulted in a massive deer die-off that occurred from all the way down to Kingston up to close to Albany. And what happens in these situations when deer are in high density is when a disease outbreak occurs, it spreads like wildfire through the population. That year in 2021, it was my second week on the job when I got my first call about an EHD deceased deer in Kingston. 2 or 3 weeks after that, I had fielded over 2,000 calls from folks either seeing or observing deer in the process of dying. Typically, they were dying in ponds and waterways throughout the region. And we were trying to track the distribution of this outbreak because it was really one of the first times we'd experienced such a severe outbreak in New York. And this is also a climate change driven phenomenon. We hadn't experienced epizootic hemorrhagic disease up until 2007 in New York, primarily because it's spread by a biting fly or midge that thrives in southern states where it's warmer. And so as New York begins to warm, we're starting to experience more and more outbreaks of EHD. Since 2007, we had another outbreak in 2011. And then in 2020, 21, and 22, we had 3 consecutive years of EHD outbreaks. So far this year, we haven't, but this is likely going to become more common. The other disease that we're extremely worried about is chronic wasting disease. This is one that was detected in New York in 2005, but has since been eradicated, but is on its way. So Pennsylvania has chronic wasting disease. And again, when deer densities are high, it spreads like wildfire through the population. Lastly, when deer have compromised their own habitat, we start to experience something called nutrient limitations. And this is where the health of the deer overall begins to decline. And so one of the things that we monitor in the deer population each year is something called antler beam diameter. And that's what's being measured here on the skull of this buck. That antler beam diameter gives you an indication of that deer's health. And so if deer are healthy, they have excess nutrients in the system, that antler beam diameter will continue to increase with each age class. And overall, you will have a higher mean average or an average mean diameter for the population. However, if nutrient limitations start to take a role, that antler beam diameter begins to decline. And here's our data from New York for all bucks checked. So we check thousands, typically between 13,000 and 14,000 deer per year across New York State. And we calculate this, we measure this antler beam diameter. And so what you're seeing here in these graphs is the trends in antler beam diameter for each age class of buck that we check. So up in the left here is all of the yearlings. So bucks that are a year and a half old when they are checked. Bottom left is 2.5 years old, and bottom right is 3.5 years old. It's pretty clear that our antler beam diameters are on the decline. We don't know what the exact drivers are here now that are causing this, but certainly nutrient limitations have to be playing a role, and habitat ultimately is what provides nutrition for deer. So we're going to be looking into this more and trying to identify what are the specific factors influencing this decline in antler beam across the state. And I'll mention that certain areas of the state, particularly the Hudson Valley and areas that we know deer are overabundant, we're seeing more dramatic declines. So there seems to be a correlation with habitat, and we're experiencing the steepest declines. So I always go back to these photos when I kind of need to get a grounding of where do we go from here and what's the right course of action. The key question for me is, can we restore balance given all of these factors that are influencing our forests and the deer impacts that are occurring? And one of the fathers of wildlife management, Aldo Leopold, gave this quote at one time. He said, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends to do otherwise." It is very clear to me looking at this photo that something is wrong and that we need to do something about it. And so this is what motivates me to address this challenge. It is a great challenge and it requires all of us to be engaged, but we can make a difference if we take the right approaches. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on through the rest of this presentation. So what do we do in this situation? What are the key things that we can address to bring deer populations back into balance? And so what I want to show here is a basic life cycle diagram for white-tailed deer. What you're going to see on the screen are the sex and age classes in the deer population, as well as their survival rates and fecundity rates. So we have fawns in the system, both male and female. They have a certain probability of surviving to be adult deer. Those adult deer then have a certain probability of surviving into the next age class. And then it's really the females in the population, obviously, that contribute to the next cohort of individuals. What's interesting about white-tailed deer is that fawns at 7 months or 8 months can breed, which makes them extremely productive. If they reach a certain weight by their first breeding season, they can actually reproduce that following year. And the key message here is that if we just focus on bucks, if hunters just focus on bucks and are only interested in bucks, if they harvest a buck, they're only removing that one individual from the system, which really is meaningless for addressing population growth. However, if they focus on female deer, not only are they removing that one individual, but they're removing all of its future offspring. And this has a much more dramatic effect on populations than buck hunting alone. And so one of the messages that I emphasize to hunters is that for every buck that you harvest, you should be harvesting at least one, if not more, antlerless deer or does to be good stewards of the deer population. So now let's think about these two paradigms that we're in. We had the past where deer were almost brought to the brink of extinction, almost extirpated from New York. And we have the present where deer populations have become so high that they're compromising our forest ecosystems. I would say that neither one of these is sustainable, right? We'd never want to have a situation where deer are completely gone. And we never want to have a situation where deer are so overabundant that they compromise our forest ecosystems and have all these other societal and economic impacts. The question is how do we find a happy medium between these two then, right? And we can think through the process of elimination and kind of rule some things out. Obviously, we can't rely on deer vehicle collisions here to help address the deer population. We can no longer rely on severe winters and deep snow, at least not as frequently as we once did. And so what that leaves us with is allowing or empowering hunters to act more like subsistence hunters, or bringing apex predators back into the system. Now, there's an important caveat with that, though. We got to remember that the habitat has changed. Can you imagine trying to reintroduce wolves and mountain lions into a situation like this? I can't. They wouldn't be tolerated, right? And probably they wouldn't stay there. They would go back to where the habitat's good, back up to Canada. Actually, we've tried this and we've seen that same effect. So many decades ago, we tried to reintroduce lynx into the Adirondacks. What did they do? They all went back to Canada. So this isn't going to be what works for us. It really comes down to what we're going to do. We have to be the ones driving change in this situation. And so what I'm going to be providing here as recommendations moving forward are all things that we can do, regardless of whether you're a hunter or not. There are things that you can do to address deer impacts. So where do we go from here? This is essentially my vision for the future. It all comes down first and foremost to ecologically based deer management. And this is my primary role as the deer biologist for New York State. This has been kind of a shift in thinking for our agency as well. This is now the first time where we use impacts to forest regeneration as the first lens we consider in our decision-making for deer management. And so forest regeneration is the top tier of what we consider. And we rely on science by Miller and McGill 2019 that essentially evaluated the level of regeneration debt across the Northeast. What does regeneration debt mean? Two things. One, there is a mismatch between what's in the canopy and what's in the understory. Ideally, they should match. If your forest is regenerating with those same trees, you need to have both in the forest overstory and understory. And two, is what's in the understory getting above deer browse height and making it into the next size classes? And so what you're seeing in these maps here, on the left is the average number of seedlings per square mile across the Northeast. So those areas in green doing pretty well, where we have greater than 2 seedlings per square meter. Areas in orange doing not so great, and areas in gray not doing great as well at all. And then over here on the right, same scale, but for saplings. So if you were just to look at the seedlings map here, you might say, okay, looks like a bunch of seedlings are in the understory. What's the big deal? Problem is they're not reaching the sapling stage. They're not getting above deer browse height. And there's a variety of factors that influence this. It could be competing vegetation, forest pests and pathogens, deer. But deer certainly are one of the primary reasons for this, because if it were competing vegetation or forest impacts, you wouldn't expect to see such a disparity between these two maps. You would see seedlings reaching that next size class, and we're just not seeing that in large areas of the Northeast. The next lens that we look at is whether deer, if the population could be reduced, would we see increased forest regeneration? And this is science based on, or from Martin Lesser et al. In 2019, that evaluated the level of deer impact or deer reduction necessary to achieve increased seedling density. And so what you're seeing on this map is areas of the state where there would be marginal or little change if deer populations were reduced, and where there would be dramatic change if deer populations were reduced. So areas of the Hudson Valley in particular show up in this orange and red, where if we were to decrease deer populations by 25%, we could expect a increase in seedling density of 5 to 15%, 15 to 30%, even greater than 30% in certain areas of New York. And then lastly, as a public trust agency, we have to evaluate public preference for deer population change. And so we survey the public every 3 or 4 years to evaluate whether they think the deer population should be reduced. And we do this through Cornell University and their Center for Conservation Social Science. And we essentially ask folks randomly through a coordinated survey of whether they would like to see more, the same, or fewer deer in their area. And this ultimately results in the deer population trajectory that we set for each area of the state. So increase, maintain, or decrease. In this last round, here are the results of that process. So nowhere in the state are we looking to increase the deer population. Throughout most of the state, we're looking to stay the same. And throughout the Hudson Valley, Long Island, and the Finger Lakes region, we're looking to decrease the deer population by at least 25% by 2030. You might say, shouldn't we be decreasing the population in more areas? That's probably a fair argument, given the information that I shared previously. But we also consider public preference for what they would want to see. And part of the reason I'm here tonight is because there's a lack of awareness of deer impacts and what is happening in our forests. If more people were aware and understood that deer population reduction was necessary to safeguard our forests, perhaps we would see more areas of the state in that decrease trajectory. And again, that's part of the reason why I'm giving presentations like this almost every month. Okay, so let's talk about some of the solutions and some of the things that we can do to address this problem. So one of the first ones for me is we need to encourage, equip, and empower hunters to act more like subsistence hunters. This is a picture of my wife, who took up deer hunting just a couple years ago, grew up as an animal lover, didn't really have any background in ecology. So why did she want to get involved in hunting? For one, I was her husband, obviously, and I was able to encourage her and educate her a little bit more. But the primary reason was because she wanted to know where her food was coming from. And she didn't like the idea of industrial meat production and the quality of life that those animals lived before they were essentially killed for our consumption. She knew that this deer lived a nice, healthy life out in the woods prior to being harvested. And she knew that meat was sustainably sourced because she harvested it herself. It didn't have to be transported across the country. It didn't have to be frozen, didn't have to go to the grocery store and be packaged. We did all that. And because of that, she felt much better about consuming this deer as opposed to beef, pork, or chicken. She also wanted to better understand, her role in stewardship of our ecosystems. And so she, through the things that I had mentioned to her, wanted to understand why deer population management was so important and how it could help promote the health of our forests. Those are the reasons that she got involved. And I think more people would be interested in hunting from those standpoints. It's not so much about putting a trophy on the wall. It's not so much about, camaraderie and friends and just having a fun time. There's a deeper underlying environmental stewardship associated with hunting that more people need to be aware of and I think would buy into. And so that's part of the reason why I think there's potential out there for more people to become engaged from the first place, more hunters, as well as hunters to better understand their role as stewards of the environment and be willing to take antlerless deer, does, to a better bring deer populations into balance with available habitat. So we need to message differently on why deer hunting is important and why more people should be involved. There's also tremendous potential to promote the full utilization of venison to address food insecurity. So we've been expanding our partnerships with two of the primary organizations that facilitate venison donation in New York. The first is Feeding New York State, and the other is the Venison Donation Coalition. So the funding for these organizations comes primarily from DEC. So every time a hunter goes to purchase their hunting license, they can donate additional funding to venison donation and through the Department of Health. So there's a certain line item in the Department of Health's budget that contributes to these organizations. Every single year, they spend out all of the money that they are given for venison donation. And it's difficult for me to understand that there's a tremendous need out there for food. We have this resource that could contribute to it, and yet they don't have enough funding to actually make it happen. You know, we need to facilitate that. We need to strengthen that ability for these organizations to meet the food security issues in our state, while also addressing the deer impacts and overabundant issues. It's a win-win. We just need people to buy into it. We also need to empower landowners and communities to engage in deer management on their properties. And so organizations like Columbia County Land Conservancy has begun opening up their lands to hunting. We can have more hunters, we can have more people bought into hunting, but if they don't have anywhere to go, or if where they go isn't where the deer are, then we're not going to address the problem. And so more landowners need to be willing to open up their lands to hunting, even if they don't hunt themselves. Open it up, let people come on, but let people that come on understand that you're doing so because you want them to take antlerless deer. You want them to take does off the landscape. If they're coming on and saying, oh, I'm just gonna shoot a buck, you know, they're not really interested in your same interests. They don't care so much about, you know, the forest health impacts. If they really did, they'd be willing to contribute towards your objectives of reducing the deer population. So make sure you get the right hunters on your property and make sure that they're taking those antlerless deer when they have opportunity. We also have tools available for property owners to enhance the effectiveness of deer management. So we have programs like the Deer Management Assistance Program. Many organizations in the room today apply for this. It provides additional antlerless deer tags to hunters that use the property. And it's property specific. So you submit an application for your property, we review and approve it. It's a free application by August 1st with a 3-year permit renewal and reporting cycle. And so typically there's not a shortage of deer tags out there. But in certain situations where you have a lot of deer on the landscape, you need more tags in the system. And this program provides that to those hunters utilizing the property. We also have this next level of management intensity called our deer damage permits. So if you're experiencing severe acute deer damage to your crop, or in your municipality through deer vehicle collisions, potentially nursery or ornamental planting damage, you can apply for this at any time of year, and allows you to take those deer out of the system when that damage is occurring. So it's meant to address those acute deer impacts. You can apply for it outside of the hunting season using non-hunting related techniques. So this will also allow things like shooting at night, baiting, tactics that typically wouldn't be allowed during the hunting season. This also is a free application with no deadline and has an annual application reporting period. And for communities that are interested in becoming more engaged in deer management, we have this community deer management guide on our website where you can go and learn about how to set yourself up for success and get your community engaged in deer management. The other thing that we need to start talking more about is promoting personal venison consumption for its many ecological, animal welfare, and human health benefits. I mentioned this as being a primary motivation for my wife, but deer or venison can be excellent table fare if prepared properly. And this is where it also contributes to climate change mitigation. One of the simplest things we can do to address climate change is to shift our diet away from meat to a vegetarian diet, or to a locally sourced meat diet. This provides that. Venison is locally sourced. So think about consuming venison yourself. You don't have to be an active hunter to do this. You can consume venison on your own, and ideally make sure that it's wild venison if possible. Have someone give you some. I'm going to talk about how we can enhance this program or this strategy in a little bit. But you can consume venison on your own and not have to hunt yourself to participate in addressing this challenge. And many of these strategies are articulated in our overarching management plan for white-tailed deer in New York State. And so the overarching goals of our plan are population management, hunting and recreation, conflict and damage management, education and communication, deer habitat, and operational resources. And I would encourage you to go through our management plan at some point and learn more about some of the strategies that we're advancing to address deer overabundance in certain areas of the state. I also want to be clear on some of the things that prohibit us or limit us from advancing these approaches and strategies. So in Appendix 8 of our deer management plan, we have listed these legal restrictions and recommendations. There are certain laws that were passed back when deer needed to be protected that are still in place and that now limit our ability to reduce deer populations where needed. So for example, setting conditions under which hunters can sell and receive compensation for venison. Currently, hunters cannot sell venison in New York because of an antiquated law. Imagine if hunters were able to be compensated for any additional deer that they harvested and wanted to sell. How that would increase harvest of antlerless deer and personal consumption of venison throughout communities. Another antiquated one, allow deer management permits throughout the northern zone. So in the 1970s, DEC's authority to issue antlerless deer tags, which are deer management permits, was taken away in the northern zone in certain Adirondack units. Now, with climate change and milder winters, we're seeing deer populations increase in those areas. We know that deer impacts are increasing and deer browse pressure on our forests is increasing, but we don't have any ability to address it or very limited ability to address it because we can't issue deer management permits in many of those units. I won't go through the full list here, but there are laws that need to be changed given the change in situation. We are no longer in a situation where deer are going to be extirpated from New York. We're in a situation where they are now overabundant and impacting our forest ecosystems, society, and our economy. And so these laws that were protectionist in nature when they were implemented need to be removed or changed. So that's where I'm going to leave it for tonight. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions, and I appreciate you all coming out tonight and for those on the phone. But again, what I want to emphasize is that anyone can play a role in this issue. Those strategies that I articulated, you can play a role in one way or another. You don't have to be a hunter. You don't even have to really understand deer management. There are little things that you can do, and I hope you will after this presentation. Thank you.
Just give that 1 second. All right, thank you, Brendan. That was phenomenal. We have a number of questions on Zoom, so maybe we'll start there. Then move to some audience questions. All right, great. All righty. All right, Brian Bird asked 2 questions here. Are there any data on how modern hunting preferences, like passing younger bucks in order to take a larger buck, has impact on deer populations?
So we have seen a shift in hunter preference for older age class bucks over the past 20, 30 years. So for example, in the 1970s, about 30% of our buck harvest was bucks of older age class. 70% was bucks that were 1.5 years old. That has now shifted. So this past year, 70% of the bucks harvested in New York were 2.5 years old or older, whereas only 30% were yearlings. That's that's good for hunters that care about large antlers, larger body sizes, more meat on those deer. I support that, but we also need to ensure that those same hunters are taking antlerless deer. If you're only interested in buck hunting, and seeing changes in buck age structure, but are unwilling to take antlerless deer to support deer being in better balance with available habitat, you're only playing part of your role in stewardship of the deer population.
Thank you. Any data on how many acres per hunter has changed over the years as fewer landowners allow hunter access?
I don't have any data. We do know that land access has declined for a variety of reasons. So urban sprawl, more land being leased for hunting as opposed to being open to anyone to hunt on. However, there's been more state land acquired, which is open access for hunting. So that has somewhat counteracted that effect. But one of my key messages tonight is that more landowners should have their land open to hunting and understand the benefits of hunting. Again, with emphasis that those hunters that they allow on the property should be contributing to sound deer management and taking those antlerless deer when they have the opportunity.
Great. All right, let's take a question from the audience.
Thank you. So I wanted to see if you could say a little bit more about the programs where venison is contributed for food security. All the hunters I know give their meat to keep it from themselves or give it to their family members. And it's not like they have a ton left over. And so I'm just wondering, you made it sound as though if we had more money, there would be a lot more that would be contributed, but how do you assess who's giving that meat away, and is part of the money paying them, or is that just the money for processing and distribution? So just talk a little bit more about how much could that expand if there was more money?
Yeah. So right now, the funding that is allocated to venison donation goes to paying the processors that cut up the deer for it to be donated. And so Feeding New York State and the Venison Donation Coalition spend about $3.50 per pound for that venison. They pay that directly to those cooperating processors to process that deer and then donate it. And so that venison either goes to the regional food banks to be distributed or to local food pantries primarily. What we do know is that supply is meeting demand right now. We, for several years, have spent out all the money available. And so hunters have been able to contribute enough to spend out everything that's available. I don't know what the potential is for level of increase. All I know is that we're already meeting it right now. If certain laws were changed, I think it could be a substantial component to addressing the food insecurity issue. And many other states have taken this approach where they are using venison donation programs as a major component of their food insecurity initiatives.
All right, one more from the audience and then we'll move on to Zoom.
I have a follow-up question on the issue of food safety with collecting venison for food pantries, and if that were to be expanded or even potentially commercialized, that we were able to get more venison out to the public or even restaurants. I guess my question is, how is the safety of that meat regulated? Is it tested for chronic wasting disease and other things currently? And would there be resources available to ensure that?
So all of the processors that are engaged in venison donation are inspected. So that venison goes through the same processes that any other meat that would pass through their shop would. So for the commercial sale, though, that's something we would have to figure out, is how to go through that same rigorous inspection process that restaurants have to move through to serve their beef or pork on their menu, and that would need to be ironed out. I want to emphasize that chronic wasting disease isn't spread to people. So at least there's never been a case of that we're aware of. So there's little concern of disease transmission as a result of this. It's more of the logistics of ensuring that the inspection processes are happening. The similar situation that I can relate this to is mushroom foraging. Right now, there are many individuals who go out and forage for mushrooms and can sell those to local restaurants to serve on their menu with very little barriers to doing that. Venison could probably do the same. We could probably do the same thing with venison if our laws were different. We would need to have the sale of venison prohibition removed to allow that to happen.
All right, one more from Zoom here. Has legalization, so what is the nature of the opposition to allow hunters to sell venison?
So I'm not sure there's much opposition or as much opposition as there once was. There's always going to be hunters who think that we need more deer, that those protectionist approaches that were implemented to restore deer populations are still appropriate today. I would argue that that's not the case. And I think more and more individuals would actually be supportive of this change, given the benefits it would have on transitioning folks to a different source of protein and meat in their diet, and incentivizing additional harvest of antlerless deer where it's necessary.
All right, another one from Zoom. Can a property owner with only 7 acres apply to the DMAP program under the pretense of extra doe management as the only reason?
So it depends on the category that you want to enroll under. If you're experiencing agricultural damage on those 7 acres, absolutely. And you might even be eligible for a deer damage permit. A deer damage permit might actually be the better tool in that situation. If you're a forest owner and are experiencing impacts to forest regeneration, we typically want you to collaborate with some of your neighbors, because if you remove deer off of 7 acres, but no one else around you is engaged in that management, it's going to have very little impact on achieving your goals. So ideally, you would have a larger acreage participating in that deer management effort and all contributing to that herd reduction over a larger spatial scale. So I'd be happy to chat with them more about what they have in mind.
Right behind me.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's really fascinating and I appreciate all the data. I'm curious about the the legal aspect of this. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the DEC and the state legislature? And are you able to, give a white paper to members of, our elected officials? Or is the system such that we have to take it to our elected officials? What's the level of awareness in the state level government? I guess is my question.
Good question. So we can, and we do, advocate for the things that we would like to see changed to existing laws. We typically do that by articulating those things in our management plans. What we can't do is comment on pending legislation. And I don't have a direct interface with the New York State Legislature. We have our Legislative Affairs Office that interacts with the legislature, but there are a variety of priorities and items on their agenda, and we only have limited opportunity to advance those things. And so really external advocacy is necessary in a lot of these situations. And that's why we try and promote the changes that we would like to see as much as possible through presentations like this and through articulating those things in our management plan. We would love to see additional partners engaged on this issue.
I was curious if you know what the population of deer is per square mile in Columbia County, say, and if you do, well, the other question would be, what would be the ideal population per square mile?
Mm-hmm. So deer populations are notoriously difficult to census. They are a cryptic species, and typically you would need to use remote camera traps, aerial surveys, those types of things to actually get an accurate number, which are very costly and logistically demanding. So we don't implement those types of strategies. What we monitor instead are deer impacts. We care more about the level of impact that the deer population is having, because that's ultimately what we need to change and address. And so impacts to forest regeneration is one of the things that we're monitoring. We're hoping to also build out a statewide camera trap study that would get us a better sense of the deer density across the state. That's in the very preliminary stages, but there will be opportunity for citizen science engagement in that, where you can install a camera trap on your property and contribute to this statewide data set that will give us more information on deer population size, as well as a variety of other wildlife species.
All right, one more from Zoom. Are there any groups that link landowners with responsible hunters?
Not that I'm aware of. So yeah, Troy has started down this road. We would also like to try and play a role in this. So we know that there's a variety of landowners out there who would be interested in having a deer management program occur on their property, but are intimidated, either because they don't know how to manage hunters effectively, or are just don't have the resources to dedicate to that type of effort and administration of a program. We want to try and help bridge the gap there. So one of the things we're considering is partnering with an organization called Hunt Stand that provides a system, a reservation system, essentially, where hunters can reserve a slot for a particular property, and it provides the property owner ability to kind of review where those hunters are, which areas they've been hunting, how successful they've been, and gives them some level of accountability, the hunter's accountability, to help achieve that organization's goals. So again, this is very preliminary, but we're hoping to expand some effort like that down the road.
Great. There's a question about chronic wasting disease and its impact on the deer herd. Is there concern at DEC as chronic wasting disease shows up that it could potentially decimate deer populations?
So chronic wasting disease doesn't result in deer population collapse. What it does is it typically changes the age structure in those populations. So instead of deer surviving to be 4, 5, 6 years old, they typically only survive to be 3 years old. Obviously, that's a concern for hunters that want to see older age class bucks with larger antlers. And we obviously wouldn't want to see that from a deer population health standpoint either. We want to see a healthy deer population. And the most challenging thing about chronic wasting disease is once it's present, it's nearly impossible to eradicate. New York is the only state that has been able to eradicate CWD after an initial detection. And so it is likely to be permanent once it is here. So hunters play a really important role here in ensuring that they're not bringing CWD into the state through deer that they harvest out of state. And everyone plays a role in making sure that if you see a deer that's emaciated, sick looking, acting funny, that you report it to us so that we can have it tested.
One more quick question. You said that DEC isn't allowed to comment on existing legislation, but is there anybody out there in the New York State Legislature that's kind of a champion of this idea? And is there any existing current legislation that we could, as citizens, just say, hey, let's promote this?
So there's no pending legislation that I'm aware of related to the items in Appendix 8 that I referenced during my presentation. There certainly are champions in the legislature that I think would be willing to talk more about this or take it up. I won't give any specific names right now, but we always recommend that you reach out to the Environmental Conservation Committee as the starting place. They're really the ones that advance the conservation agenda and that we interact with most on issues like this.
Thank you for an outstanding presentation. The solutions you propose are practical, pragmatic, sensible, but there's an elephant in the room. We all know that. Hunting is anathema to many, many individuals. Okay, there's a problem there. On one hand, like individuals like myself really want to support it, but on the humane level, there's a brutality aspect, and unfortunately, hunters are not very good shots always, and animals suffer, and that's repugnant to many of us, and it's a difficult aspect to deal with. Which leads me to ask, I mean, are there other pathways that you can eradicate deer, or at least, take them out of the ecosystem through trapping or something, and then a more humane form of sacrifice could be performed that involves less suffering. In addition, there's another aspect to hunting, which is that hunting is very jarring to everyone in the valley. You hear the gunshots, it's very disturbing. And unless, again, I'm recognizing the practical necessity of what you're describing, but it's difficult as sensitive human beings sometimes to actually, deal with that, the palatability aspects of it. So could you comment on that, please?
Absolutely. So there are other strategies. Many of the municipalities that we work with don't use recreational hunting as their primary source of deer population control for the reasons that you state. They're concerned about public safety issues in their municipality. They don't want hunters taking errant shots, those types of things, and they're worried about the public perception and issues and humane treatment of the deer. And so one of the tools that I mentioned during my presentation, that these deer damage permits can also allow trained individuals to participate in these culling efforts. And so there are several organizations, USD APHIS being one of them, and another organization called White Buffalo, that go into communities and perform strategic and coordinated deer management using trapping, as you mentioned, and then lethal means after that reduce that trauma that could be experienced. And sometimes they use trained sharpshooters as well. And so if that's a particular concern in a community, our community guidebook provides guidance on that and how you can move through obtaining a deer damage permit and coordinating with one of these organizations where you pay them to take that more strategic and coordinated approach. Actually, before, I want to mention one other thing. So a good example of this is the city of Ithaca. So Ithaca, being near Cornell University, had a lot of concerns about just allowing hunters into the community, had a lot of individuals that wanted to see, humane removal of the deer. And at its worst, the deer population in and around Ithaca was over 100 per square mile. Just amazing numbers. And through annual contracts with an organization, they brought the deer population down to about 10 per square mile. So it can be extremely effective if you're willing to invest in that level of removal. It is expensive.
Yeah, I'm thinking I have friends who are vegetarians. They recognize the problem. They're never going to eat venison. They're never going to hunt. But they want to do something. And I'm thinking of, other remedies like sterilization or contraception. Can you speak to any of those?
Absolutely. So various forms of deer contraception and sterilization have been researched for decades. Really the only situations where they've found to be effective are in closed habitats that don't have any form of deer immigration. So situations like islands or fenced off areas. The reason for that is because deer disperse long distances and they immigrate. And so if you control deer in a particular area through contraception and sterilization, you have new deer coming into the system constantly. And those new deer coming in still have the ability to reproduce and can contribute to population growth. So in order for it to be effective, either it needs to be very intensive and all the deer that come into the system each year have to be treated. Again, very costly and logistically demanding, or it needs to be combined with some form of lethal control. If you do both of them simultaneously, it can have some benefit. And there's ongoing research on this. The only permits that we issue for deer contraception or sterilization in New York are for research purposes, because we realize that there is potential to potentially, find something that would be more effective. We just haven't found it yet.
Seems the hunter population is, not in alignment with the goals that you're talking about in general. Is there any group of hunters that are in alignment, organized, that can be a vector of education in the hunter population? And are there efforts to teach hunting, advocate for hunting maybe in populations that aren't really involved? Well, you mentioned your wife, so women. Are there efforts to reach out to populations that traditionally are not part of the hunter population? So 2 questions.
Yeah, good questions. So it's important to remember that hunters are constrained to shoot additional deer in most cases, because they're trying to meet their own consumption demands. And typically 1 or 2 deer per family does that. So if they had more ability to sell the venison or use it in other ways, you might see more hunters willing and able to take additional antlerless deer. But to be fair, there are hunters out there who primarily care about buck hunting, and that 1 deer that they take per year is a buck, and that does not contribute to deer population management at all if they're only behaving in that way. So we need to encourage hunters to take more antlerless deer, and we're invested in a variety of strategies to do that right now through education and outreach, and through surveys of hunters to better understand their motivations and values for harvesting antlerless deer. In the near future, we're going to be likely rolling out some regulatory changes that will require hunters to take antlerless deer, or at least give them more opportunity to. And so we're going to try and make that happen as soon as possible. The other question that you had about new hunters and new diversity of hunters. So there's a variety of strategies DEC is implementing on that. So we have our mentored hunt program. We have our Becoming an Outdoors Woman program, and we have our standard R3 initiatives, which stands for Hunter Recruitment, Retention, and Reactivation. And so all of those things are being implemented to try and build out the base of hunters, and ideally see more people engaged from different backgrounds.
All right, last question for the audience, and then one last question for Zoom. Oh, sorry.
Brendan, I wanted to ask you about while waiting for the frustration with a systemic change, the legislatures and the laws, there are communities that rise up and get so frustrated. You pointed up to, I don't know the situation in Ithaca, but could you talk about a couple of those? Because it's pretty interesting. And how that happens, and do you welcome those things, pilot projects, but also trying to take care of really serious local issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ithaca is a great example. So they had been advancing research at Cornell University, evaluating various tactics to reduce the deer population, including fertility control. We're having challenges with achieving their goals, and came to us with the idea of establishing a deer management focus area in and around Tompkins County, which we've established and provides additional hunting opportunities throughout January in that community. And we did that knowing that the community was also bought into the level of control that I described earlier, where they're taking more concerted effort in those areas where hunting really isn't an option. And that's really been beneficial in reducing the deer population, not only in the city of Ithaca, but some of the surrounding areas that were experiencing those deer impacts. So the community engagement is really critical here. Ideally, we would see a number of communities all bought into this and willing to support some of the legislative items as well.
Okay. Last question here about extending the gun season, and hunters often find that the doe tag lottery system, sometimes they get 2, sometimes they get 0. How can New York make doe hunting part of the regular season and allow hunters more tags?
So in most areas of the state, we're increasing the availability of doe tags or deer management permits, as I mentioned earlier. Exceptions being areas of the Adirondacks where we're prohibited from issuing those DMPs, and some areas of the Catskills where deer populations still are fairly low. But in most areas, there's an abundance of tags. It's important to remember that you can apply for 2 DMPs at point of sale when you purchase your hunting license, but you can also get 2 transferred to you from other hunters. And in any wildlife management unit where there's a surplus, come November 1st, you can go back and get 2 more. And so there shouldn't really be many situations where doe tag availability is so limited that you can't get your hands on at least 1 or 2. If you take advantage of all those different options available to you.
All right. Well, Brendan, thank you so much. This was eye-opening for myself, and I'm sure everybody on Zoom and here in person. Thank you so much, everybody who showed up. We really, really appreciate it, and look forward to more from Partners for Climate Action on addressing the crisis of deer overpopulation in New York. So thank you, everybody.